Alright, this is a pretty straightforward tutorial how to create just a nice fog effect for your landscape or scene or whatever. I'll be using Blender 2.8, so if you don't have it, this should work fine in older versions. It'll be just a little bit different, but you should be able to figure it out if you don't know how. Before we get started, just make sure that under the Light Paths tab, your volume bounces are set to at least 1. I like to use 3 or maybe even 5. This will let light bounce off surfaces into volume, into like volumetric materials to create much more realistic colors and whatnot. Coloration, if you have a green landscape, the fog will be tinted a bit green because it bounces off. And then also, it's very important that under the Volumes tab, or if in a previous version, the Geometry tab, you need to make sure that your step size is probably more than 0.1. You might want 0.1. That's the default value, but you usually want a higher one because that's just going to be that's going to be some really intense ray tracing on your graphics card or CPU or whatever you're running on. This will render much faster, and you'll be less likely to crash while you're rendering. So just get right into the actual tutorial. So first thing you'll want to do is just create a cube and just essentially scale it up to the correct dimensions that you want for your fog. Let's see, so like however much you want to cover your landscape. Also just go down here and set this display to wire or to bounds. Really the same thing. Bounds probably looks actually a bit nicer. But you can see, to go to face select here and get it really close here to make sure that we're not losing any. It just makes it a lot easier because of how we're going to actually be making the fog of material. So if you render it, you can see not yet actually fog, it's just a solid block. So down here in the shader editor or the node editor, you can create a new material. We'll not be using this one because that's for like hard actual physical surfaces. We want volumetrics, so search up principled volume. This is the new shader in 2.8, but if you're using an older version, you can just use the volume scatter or volume absorption mixed together with the scatter. So it's essentially the same thing, but this is just easier to use. I'm going to make the color brighter because it's just more realistic for what fog should look like. It shouldn't be really dark and gloomy unless that's how you want it. And then turn down the density here, something like 0.2. And that already looks kind of nice. Maybe a bit much. That already looks pretty cool, but to make it more realistic, let's add in a gradient texture with texture coordinates and a mapping node. This will allow us to actually create the gradient effect you see where it fades from the bottom to the top in a very pretty looking way. So we'll connect this vector to that and then use generated coordinates. I think by default it already uses generated, but just make sure that. So connect these two. And then using the node Wrangler add-on, which you can enable in 2.8, go preferences and add-ons and just search up node Wrangler and make sure it's checked and then say preferences. This will allow you to much easier preview the nodes that you have from when you're working with procedural materials. So, and I'll do all sorts of other quick node workflow related things. So with it, we can just do Control plus Shift and then click on the gradient texture, and we can see what this actually looks like. And what this is, so far this is not what we want. We want the gradient to go from the bottom to the top, not from the front to the back. So we'll rotate it on the Y, in this case -90. You can just type that in, and then let's move it up on the X because that's just the one that we have to use. And then make sure it's at the top. It should be black. It shouldn't be a bit dark, like gray or dark gray. Make sure it's actually black because that means that it's actually fading to nothing and not fading to almost nothing, because that's not going to look as nice. And then that's essentially it for that part. And we can already just plug this into the density. And we'll remove the viewer here. And we can see this already looks really cool. This looks like some really nice looking fog. It's probably a bit too dense right now, but we'll fix that later. And this looks really cool. Especially from a distance, if we had like a massive, larger landscape, we could see like, you know, mountains poking out of the top of the fog. And then, so yeah, so from here, we can balance out what we want the gradient to actually be like. So we'll use an Rgb Curves, and we can preview this again with Control plus Shift plus click, and then see what that's like. So first, down here isn't actually all the way white. Also, this is poking out a bit. Let's fix that. This isn't 100%. It's just a little gray, which means that we're not getting as much gradient as we can. We can fix that over here with the scale, but I think it's just easier to do it right here. We can drag this little dot, which means the highest value, I think, or like the white value, the 1. We can drag that over and make sure that it's actually getting to the actual white point. And I think it is, or at least almost. Now let's also increase this contrast here. Maybe not that much. Maybe it's just so it's a little more dense here and a little less dense up here, just to create the nicer looking contrast. Do this however you want. Just like change this on the Y or another way. You can see actually probably put this a little bit too far. That'll probably be okay. And then we get some really nice gradient effects going here. Remove this again. You can see this looks way nicer. But we're not done yet, because if you want to directly change the density of this, maybe you want tons of fog, maybe you want just a little bit, just for a really subtle effect, you can do Shift A again and just find the math node and set this to multiply. We can just directly multiply the value of the gradient texture, and we can get, you know, super dense fog with multiplying by a really high number, or we can lower it down to be a bit much more subtle foggy effect, which looks really cool. Super subtle. I think just a value of 1 in this case looks really nice. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. I can render this out, but that'll take a little bit because volumetrics are pretty performance heavy for the most part. But yeah, I hope you learned something from this, and see you later.